Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Hillel Neuer. I am the Executive Director of UN Watch. We are honored to open our NGO side event as part of the 50th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in connection with the Commission of Inquiry on Israel and the Palestinian territories, also known as the Pillay Commission, which will present this afternoon before the Council. Because of the renovations here at the Palais des Nations, the side events are taking place next to the UN. For 11 consecutive days, starting on May 10th, 2021, Palestinian terrorists from Hamas and Islamic Jihad fired over 4,000 rockets at Israeli civilian centers, including Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. In the middle of the night, families across Israel hurried into bomb shelters. Miraculously, the country's Iron Dome anti-missile system intercepted 90% of the rockets. Yet those that did get through managed to kill 13 Israelis, injuring hundreds more, and caused damage and devastation to homes, schools, and industry. Israel's Air Force responded by striking hundreds of terrorist positions in Gaza, including a vast underground network of Hamas terror tunnels. Although Hamas and Islamic Jihad deliberately fired their rockets from within densely populated areas, and you'll hear much more about that from our two experts on the panel, Israel took extensive precautions to limit civilian casualties, notifying residents prior to attacks. Even the UN's top official in Gaza acknowledged that the IDF strikes were precise, sophisticated, and did not target civilians. Nevertheless, 1 week after the ceasefire on May 27th, here in Geneva, here at the Council, the Palestinians and Pakistan, acting on behalf of the Islamic Group of States, which includes Iran and Syria, initiated an emergency session of the Human Rights Council. Now, it's fitting that we say a few words about this council, which now marks its 50th session. Despite its name, the Human Rights Council, 2/3 of this body is comprised of brutal regimes such as China, Cuba, and Qatar. Not surprisingly, in its 16 years of existence, there has never been a single commission of inquiry into human rights abuses in China, Cuba, or Qatar. Thus, the detention of 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in camps in China has never been the object of a single debate, special session, resolution, or investigation by this council. Instead, at every single one of its meetings for the past 50 sessions, built into the agenda, the council singles out Israel for condemnation under a special agenda item, item 7. The Human Rights Council has passed more resolutions against the Jewish state than on Syria, Iran, and North Korea combined. The Council routinely creates commissions of inquiry targeting Israel, effectively denying the country's right to self-defense. These false and one-sided reports grant propaganda victories to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, incentivizing the terrorists to continue launching wars. This time, although the minority of democracies such as Britain, Germany, and the Czech Republic voted in opposition, an automatic majority, as they always do, succeeded in creating yet another commission of inquiry. But this one is different. It's unprecedented. The scope of this commission of inquiry includes not only the war of last year, May 2021, but of all events leading up to it, going back decades, and since, everything that's happened since May 2021. They also have the broad mandate to examine, quote, root causes of the conflict, including alleged systematic discrimination based on race. We'll have our second panel starting at 11:30. We'll address that issue. Now, whereas all past inquiries on Israel here at the UN Human Rights Council lasted for about a year, this one is perpetual. It goes on forever. The inquiry has a large staff of lawyers tasked with collecting evidence, admissible in international tribunals. The whole point of this is to feed the investigation targeting Israel in The Hague in the International Criminal Court, as well as any other potential criminal proceedings anywhere else in the world that might target Israel and Israelis. And their budget is millions of dollars a year. Now, although the inquiry claims that it will examine both sides, and the initial report that came out last week has a passing reference to Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, both of these entities are their most enthusiastic supporters. Hamas celebrated the report, This is the only case of the Human Rights Council where one of the reports is celebrated by a terrorist group recognized by the United States, Canada, the European Union, Hamas. Hamas called this a new and important addition. So Hamas and the Human Rights Council are in agreement. And the reason that Hamas and the PA are enthusiastic supporters of this Commission of Inquiry is because they are assured of its outcome, that it will support their campaign to try and criminalize the State of Israel. Now, lest there be any doubt, the UN made their intentions crystal clear by the person they appointed to chair the inquiry, Ms. Navi Pillay. United Nations rules require that commissioners be impartial. These are rules of the UN Human Rights Office, which is the Secretariat of the Human Rights Council. They passed these rules in part after William Schabas headed the inquiry in 2014, someone who was forced to resign based on a conflict of interest because, among other things, it was revealed Mr. Schabas had done paid legal work for the PLO. He had done paid legal work for the PLO, and he was head of the inquiry into Israel. He was also saying things like his favorite criminal that he wanted to see in the dock of the International Criminal Court was the Israeli Prime Minister, who he was basically investigating as head of the inquiry. He was forced to resign. In wake of that, the UN clarified rules that when the heads of inquiries, the commissioners of inquiries, have to be impartial. Impartiality includes their public statements. In the case of Navi Pillay, it's not just an issue of public statements that she's made, but she's actually become an advocate, lobbying against Israel. Pillay is the very opposite of impartiality. When she served as the UN Human Rights Chief here in Geneva from 2008 to 2014, Navi Pillay was the chief defender of the anti-Semitic Durban II conference. In 2010, she accused Israel of treating international law with, quote, perpetual disdain. These are words she never used on China, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, any other country in the world. Israel alone, she said, treats international law with perpetual disdain. These were a contemptuous attitude that marked her approach towards Israel. On repeated occasions, Pillay has publicly accused Israel of being an apartheid state. We'll hear more about the facts about that claim in our second panel. Navi Pillay has signed petitions lobbying governments. Again, these are not just statements. She's lobbied governments to, quote, sanction apartheid Israel. She's the head of this inquiry. Weeks after the May 2021 war of last year, Navi Pillay signed a letter to US President Joe Biden accusing Israel of provoking the war through, quote, aggressive actions and practicing discrimination and systemic oppression. So she accused Israel, she declared Israel guilty of the very war last year that she's meant to investigate. This is absurd. It happens in no other inquiry here at the Human Rights Council, only the one targeting Israel. Navi Pillay was clearly appointed to ensure a guilty verdict against Israel, to label it an apartheid state with the UN's imprimatur. Now, the Commission's report, the initial report that came out last week is just an initial report. The staff is still being crystallized. They're still putting this together, and they have time. This is the first report here in Geneva. In September or October, they'll present in New York, and then again in Geneva, again in New York, forever. It's the only, virtually the only inquiry that has an unlimited mandate. And we can assume that one of the next reports will accuse Israel of war crimes from the war last year with Hamas, and will accuse Israel of committing the crime of apartheid. Now, together with 10,000 people who've signed our online petition, we urge today all United Nations member states to speak up and demand an end, to take action to end this perpetual inquiry, which has all the credibility of a Stalinist show trial. We're encouraged by the fact that the United States and several other countries are meant to be delivering a joint statement today which will distance itself from this inquiry, but it must be ended. Until it is disbanded, we will continue to submit evidence to put the facts and the law on the record, and if these are disregarded, as the initial report completely disregarded what was submitted to them by numerous stakeholders, they said, we spoke with Palestinian stakeholders, we spoke with Israeli stakeholders, and they're all in agreement. The root cause of the conflict is Israeli occupation. No other dissenting voice. This is what they heard from stakeholders. So they're already ignoring many submissions that were made from Israeli and other NGOs and other experts. But until it's disbanded, we're going to continue to submit evidence. and we will hold them to account. And that is why we've invited today top experts to present testimony, all of which will be submitted to the Commission of Inquiry. Our first panel will deal with the laws of war in connection with last year's conflict. And the second panel will deal with the issue of alleged systemic discrimination. And with that, I would like to begin our first panel. I have the honor to introduce our first speaker, who's sitting to my right. And I think it's fair to say that if we are free today to go about our lives in peace and security, it is only because, as the poet Rudyard Kipling poignantly put it, there are uniforms that guard you while you sleep. Our panel's distinguished speakers are people such as these to whom all of us owe our freedom. Colonel Richard Kemp has been fighting terrorists around the globe for 4 decades. He was commander of British forces in Afghanistan, where he set up a joint counter-terrorist operation with US, Canadian, and Afghan forces that achieved major operational success against al-Qaeda terrorists in Kabul. Because of his expertise, the British cabinet brought him to Whitehall, serving as a member of the COBRA National Crisis Management Committee, chair of the COBRA Intelligence Group, head of the Joint Intelligence Committee's International and Domestic Terrorism Team. In 2005, he worked in Baghdad, Fallujah, and northern Iraq on intelligence and counterterrorism for the United States ambassador. Previously, Colonel Kemp completed 14 active duty tours as a military commander in Northern Ireland and many global hotspots. Working alongside US forces, he took part in the liberation of Kuwait in 1991. He commanded British troops in the UN Protection Force in Bosnia and was counterterrorism advisor to the Macedonian government. Colonel Kemp was made commander of the Order of the British Empire for his work on the July 2005 London bombings and in Iraq, member of the Order of the British Empire for intelligence work in Northern Ireland, and was awarded the Queen's Commendation for Bravery for his action during the Bosnia conflict. Colonel Kemp is author of Attack State Red, a best-selling book about the conflict in Afghanistan, and a prolific journalist in print and broadcast media. We are honored that he has come here to testify, to tell the United Nations about the study that he undertook on behalf of the high-level military group. Colonel Kemp.
Thank you very much. Nothing more I need to say after that glowing report. Can I start off by, though, thanking you very much, Hillel, for inviting me here. And I'd also like to take the opportunity of complimenting you and UN Watch on the fantastic work that you do. I think you show an example to all of us in battling injustice at the United Nations. So thank you, and keep at it. I'm going to just speak briefly about a report that I was involved in writing for an organization called the High-Level Military Group. The High-Level Military Group, which I'm sure you've all heard of, is a group of 14 retired generals, admirals, air marshals, whose role really is to study conflict, modern-day conflict, and learn lessons that are applicable across from one country to another. And that includes, of course, the war in Gaza. And we've conducted a number of studies into the Gaza conflict, as well as into the conflict and potential conflicts in Lebanon and elsewhere. And when I say retired generals, I'm talking about mainly retired chiefs of staff. For example, we have the former British Army Chief of Staff, we have the former Canadian Army Chief of Staff, the former Indian Army Chief of Staff. There are generals from around the world who, in their own time, go and visit countries such as Israel and learn and understand what happened so they can make recommendations. And we conducted an investigation during and immediately after the 2021 Gaza conflict and came up with a number of observations from that conflict, which I'm going to run through briefly now. First of all, the causes of the conflict, which obviously are, I'm not going to go into detail about this because it's very complex, but obviously are presented very often as being the result of Israeli-inspired violence in Jerusalem, which Hamas was responding to, whereas those of us who understand it know very well that the cause of this conflict was not Hamas defending Jerusalem by firing rockets at the Zionist entity. It was a power struggle between Hamas and Fatah surrounding the election process that was taking place, that was cancelled by Abbas because he reckoned that Hamas was going to win the election. And by firing rockets, obviously it was aimed at strengthening the hand of Hamas over Fatah in future issues. It's more detailed and more complicated than that, of course, but that's in outline the reality. I just want to mention also the role of Iran in all this. Iran encouraged this conflict, and it didn't just encourage it by funding Hamas and even more so Palestinian Islamic Jihad and providing arms for the organizations and sending Hezbollah members to encourage them when they may be flagging somewhat. It also deliberately and specifically encouraged this particular war, and there are reports, media reports, that show how Iran did that. So Iran is playing a significant role, was playing a significant role behind the scenes in the conflict, and they claimed to have established Hezbollah on their behalf, in fact, claimed to establish a joint operations center in Lebanon, which included Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, an arm of the Iranian government, to direct and coordinate operations against Israel in this conflict, from which missiles not just fired from Gaza, but also from Lebanon, albeit relatively ineffectively. Hamas's strategy, I think probably you don't need to remind you of this, but Hamas's strategy is one thing, and that's the destruction of the State of Israel. It's laid down specifically in their charter. They talk about it all the time. It's no secret. That's their aim, is to annihilate Israel and to turn it into an Islamic state. Hamas's operations, the way they conduct that, the way they go about that at the moment, is to initiate conflict at low level or at high level, such as we saw in May, which is intended. They know they can't destroy Israel. They can't militarily seriously impact Israel. But they also know they can do their best to isolate Israel in the international community by firing missiles, carrying out tunnel attacks, carrying out other forms of attacks against Israel, which will force Israel to react. And when Israel reacts, using Hamas human shield tactics, they ensure that there are civilian casualties, which can be used as a weapon of war against the Israelis. And it's if you would class Hamas as an army, it is the first army in history that has ever deliberately attempted to create casualties among its own civilian population for its military aims. Hamas's weapons and tactics in this conflict, pretty much the same as they have in previous conflicts. And this is a little bit like Groundhog Day here at the United Nations, because periodically Hamas trigger a war, periodically the United Nations convene a commission to condemn Israel for the war that Hamas has triggered. But as in the past, they've used tunnels, and the tunnels, I think, the underground tunnels network in Gaza, which have been known as the jihad tunnels, were the main weapon of Hamas in this conflict. That was their main intention, because they expected to lure Israel on the ground into Gaza, not just from the air. They expected them to come in on the ground. And those tunnels are to both ensure the safety of Hamas commanders, but also to have movement of fighters, logistic movement, etc. But primarily they're there to try and lure Israeli forces in and then be able to attack them from behind or from all directions from these tunnels. They fired about 4,500, give or take, missiles at the Israeli civilian population, of which only 175 hit populated areas due to Israel's defenses, above all. They launched 6 suicide drones against Israel, all of which were shot down. They attempted to launch a submersible to carry out an attack against Israel. That was destroyed by Israel as well. And they attempted a border attack tunnel, sending fighters under the border using one of their tunnels, which is a tactic they've used very often before. They conducted a number of operations that prevented essential services from reaching the Palestinian people in Gaza, such as they shut off the power to desalination plants and sewerage facilities, causing not just problems within Gaza, but also environmental damage on a large scale. They damaged 6 out of 12 power lines that Israel provides power to Gaza from, and they, when under UN negotiation with Israel, the Eretz crossing was opened to let in humanitarian aid, they then attacked that operation, killing 2 civilian aid workers and wounding 6 other people, including IDF soldiers who were protecting them. So it's not just attacks against Israel. These are service attacks against their own people. On the Israeli side, the Israelis refrained from attacking Hamas prior to this conflict, prior to the intensification of the conflict, deliberately carrying out limited response only to sporadic missile fire in the months preceding the conflict in order to avoid causing escalation and hoping to get, to deal with the problem through international diplomacy. And during this conflict, Israel prevented every single attack that Hamas attempted to carry out with Iranian backing, except for a small percentage of rockets and some anti-tank fire. The reason that they were very successful in this conflict, Israel, in terms of protecting its people, are really twofold. Firstly, defensive, the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome, without the Iron Dome, a lot more Israeli people would have died and a lot more Palestinians in Gaza would have died, because had it not been for the Iron Dome, which is actually a weapon that doesn't just protect Israeli civilians but protects Gaza civilians as well, had it not been for the Iron Dome, if these thousands of missiles had not been shot down, then they would have caused a lot of casualties, and Israel would have had to go in very much harder and very much faster without being able to take the care they were able to take because of the shield of the Iron Dome. Secondly, a very well-developed Israeli shelter system, early warning system, and drills. On the offensive side, the high-level military group concluded that Israel carried out unprecedentedly precise and precisely targeted destructive attacks against Hamas's systems, not seen anywhere in war before at this level of precision, even in previous conflicts in Gaza. Israel has developed its tactics and capabilities and weapons to the extent that the precision they were able to use was absolutely unprecedented in order to preserve civilian life, both on the Israeli side and on the Gaza side. They carried out over 1,500 attacks against separate targets, and they neutralized 114 Hamas terrorists, including commanders. When I say neutralized, it's not clear, killed, wounded, whatever. And they destroyed 60 miles, more than 60 miles of the tunnel system underneath Gaza, and that is assessed as being probably the majority of those tunnels. There may well be a lot more, but there's certainly more, but it was a significant amount. And when I tell you 60 miles plus was destroyed, it suggests that it's a hugely extensive network in which vast amounts of money that was provided mainly to support the population in Gaza was used on this purpose. Targeting by Israel, they only targeted known military objectives. They never once during the conflict deliberately targeted a non-military objective. Obviously, in some cases, there were side effects where, for example, a house was struck containing a military objective which contained also maybe a great deal of explosive which caused collateral damage beyond that. But that wasn't the intention, of course, of Israel. They applied the laws of armed conflict not just as they're written, but above and beyond, well above and beyond the requirements of the laws of armed conflict. They confirmed every target they struck with multiple intelligence sources. They took legal advice from their lawyers in the IDF before carrying out every attack, with very few exceptions. In some cases, attacks had to be personally authorized by the Chief of Staff if they were particularly controversial or particularly risked collateral damage, personally by the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force, who authorized dozens of these attacks. They sent phone warnings, as Hillel mentioned, to tell people to get out of the buildings they were in if they were about to be struck, or to get out of the area. They carried out knock on the roof, which means deploying a low-caliber explosive which causes a loud noise but doesn't kill people, to warn people if they didn't leave as a result of phone calls. They carried out real-time visual surveillance to confirm the evacuation of civilians from certain areas. And sometimes they allowed hours after a warning before a strike took place. The only occasions when they did not give such warnings were when they were targeting high-value targets, and that particularly means senior Hamas commanders, who, if you'd warned them, of course, they would be gone, and that would be seriously damage Israel's war effort, which was, of course, to a large extent to kill Hamas commanders. Just as a point of interest, there are many pieces of footage that you may have seen of civilians in Gaza taking photographs of buildings that were about to be hit from quite close to those buildings, which suggests that they were warned. You know, they were obviously warned, but it suggests that they knew not only how precise, but also how little collateral effect it would have if they were right next to those buildings. That's something I don't think we've seen before. I won't go into detail. There was cyber operations attempted by Hamas, which were to try and jam the Iron Dome system, which Israel overcame. Just briefly on the casualties. There were 234, and some of these figures may be disputed. The figures I get are from the Meir Emmett Intelligence Center, which probably provides the most reliable basis for casualty figures, but these are the latest ones I've seen from Meir Emmett. 234 killed Palestinians in Gaza as a result of Israeli action. Of those, 114 belonged to terrorist organizations, and 11 more potentially belonged to terrorist organizations. On the Israeli side, Hamas killed 12 Israelis with rockets, wounded 352, and killed an Israeli soldier with an anti-tank missile attack. One notable casualty statistic is which is an event that caused the single most number of casualties in Gaza during the conflict was on the 16th of May, when there was an airstrike on a tunnel which ran under a road. And Israel was very careful not to target the tunnels when they were attacking them in areas where they could cause a lot of collateral damage. But in this case, the tunnel collapsed. It had been built under the road, and it also extended under houses, and the tunnel collapsed and houses collapsed in on the tunnel, so that was collateral damage and killing the largest single number. Hamas killed, during the conflict, Hamas killed 21 of their own people by either misfires of rockets or rockets falling short that were aimed at Israel. They killed 21. That means that, they killed 13 Israelis. So they killed more of their own people in this massive attack than they killed Israelis, which is quite a telling thing. And when you look at the ratios, Israel killed 51.7% civilians and 48.3% fighters, which is compared to other conflicts, and it's very hard to compare casualty rates in different conflicts, but compared to other conflicts, that is an extremely high rate of combatants to civilians killed. Hamas, in their attacks, remember, Israel killed 51.7% civilians, 48.3% combatants. Hamas killed 92.3% civilians and 7.7% combatants. The only other thing I want to say, really, that's basically the summation of the report. It's available online at, sorry to have such a contorted email address, but if you want to read the report, it's high-level-military-group.com. The only thing I would say is that what we found during our examination of the conflict was the direct opposite of what the United Nations Human Rights Council is alleging. Not just slightly different, but 100% different, where Hamas deliberately attempted, as a policy, to kill Israeli civilians and to lure Israelis to kill their own civilians. Israel did everything they possibly could, and far more than most other countries could even achieve, probably far more than any other country could achieve, in preserving the life of enemy civilians while being very effective at destroying their military infrastructure. And the kind of comments and the kind of analysis you get from the United Nations Human Rights Council does one thing above all. It encourages Hamas to maintain this policy of attempting to lure Israel and force Israel to kill its own people. Above all, that's what it does. Therefore, the UN Human Rights Council is guilty of perpetuating these conflicts, causing bloodshed, and this report will ensure there will be more of these types of attack. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Kemp. We very much appreciate you coming here and sharing with us your expert analysis of what happened last year and of how the United Nations is dealing with this. We will submit your testimony to the Commission of Inquiry. Our next speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Corn. He is the Gary Cooper Distinguished Professor of National Security Law at South Texas College of Law, Houston. Prior to that, he served in the U.S. Army for 21 years as an officer. Professor Corn's teaching and scholarship focuses on the law of armed conflict, national security law, and criminal procedure. His Army career included service as the Army's Senior Law of War Expert Advisor, Tactical Intelligence Officer in Panama, Chief of International Law for U.S. Army Europe, Professor of International and National Security Law at the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's School, and Chief Prosecutor for the 101st Airborne Division. He earned his BA from Hartwick College, his JD Juris Doctor degree with highest honors from George Washington University, his Master of Laws as the distinguished graduate from the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's School. He's also a distinguished military graduate of U.S. Army Officer Candidate School and a graduate of U.S. Army Command and General Staff Course. Professor Corn has testified as an expert witness at the Military Commission in Guantanamo, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and in federal U.S. court. He is co-author of numerous books, including The Law of Armed Conflict, An Operational Perspective, The Laws of War and the War on Terror, National Security Law and Policy Principles and Policy, in a book that we have in our office, The Law and War, A Concise Overview. And perhaps later, Professor Corn, I can ask you to dedicate the book. Would be nice. That's why I brought it. Professor Corn is a distinguished fellow at JINSA's Gumunder Center for Defense and Strategy and a member of its Gaza Conflict Task Force, which is composed of senior U.S. military commanders and legal experts. We are honored that he has come here to testify and to tell the United Nations about their report. Professor Corn.
Well, first off, I'd like to share my thanks to you for giving me the opportunity to speak and to offer a perspective that is not just mine, but really the perspective of a very similar high-level military command group that devoted a substantial amount of time reviewing the conflict in Gaza with the eye towards trying to draw lessons learned that would be relevant for future U.S. operations. So JINSA, the Jewish Institute of National Security for America, sponsors a group of retired U.S. general officers and admirals to investigate and write reports on the conflicts in Israel, and they did so after the 2021 conflict. So that group, I was doing the math a little bit last night, probably involved more than 150 plus years of hardcore operational military experience. Not lawyers. These were former battlefield commanders, senior intelligence officers, air operations commanders, etc. They spent a week in Israel working about 14 hours a day, exploring every aspect of the operation they could explore to write a report and draw lessons learned. I was privileged to be the former military lawyer that contributed to that report. And that's really what I'd like to discuss today. In many ways, what I'm going to tell you is aligned with what my friend Colonel Kemp already told you. The most profound finding from their report was the tremendous disconnect between the reality and the perception of legitimacy of IDF operations. Legitimacy has been recognized in U.S. joint doctrine, in the joint doctrine for U.S. military operations, as a potentially decisive aspect of military operations. And what we're doing here, what the Commission of Inquiry is doing, what all of you are interested in, what everything Colonel Kemp talked about, is a manifestation of that recognition. That you can win the battle tactically, and you can do it in a way that respects and complies with international law, but if the perception of your operations is illegitimacy, you've lost the strategic war. And Hamas figured that out long ago. They understand that. As a matter of fact, as one of our former colleagues on one of these, on our report that we did in 2014 noted so eloquently, he said, as a retired major general, a former tank officer, I always understood information as a supporting effort to combat. What I learned studying Hamas is that they understand combat as a supporting effort to information. They don't care about winning the fight. They care about creating a narrative that will advance their cause. Now, what is the goal of that? The goal of that is to neuter what they understand is the much more significant combat capability of the IDF to achieve their military objectives. Because when you start to paint your enemy as illegitimate, it's going to create a pressure to restrain your operations, a pressure to refrain from operations, a pressure to avoid striking targets that could have immense operational and tactical value because of the potential degradation of perceived legitimacy. And for the generals that were part of this report, what really jumped out at them was you had a truly binary equation of compliance and non-compliance with international humanitarian law. Everything they looked at told them that the IDF commanders and subordinate forces did a kind of A or A+ job in understanding and implementing their obligations under international humanitarian law. They were fighting an enemy that not only disregarded international humanitarian law, but actually used it as a weapon. Colonel Kemp talks about the willingness of Hamas to use their civilian population as potential casualties in order to win their strategic information narrative. I actually wrote an article about this about 2 years ago titled Indirect Civilian Targeting, where, and the actual title is Beyond Human Shielding. Any international lawyer who's familiar with the rules of war you speak with will tell you that human shielding is a violation of international humanitarian law. But I've become convinced, and so did all of these generals, and I think Colonel Kemp would agree with me, that what Hamas does is one level beyond that in terms of illegitimacy and illegality. They're not using civilians to shield targets. That's bad enough. When you use a civilian to try and get your enemy not to attack, that's a pernicious violation of international humanitarian law. They actually want the Israelis to attack. They're using civilians to bait the Israelis to attacking high-value targets so that it does create civilian casualties. They're not trying to avoid the attack. They want the attack to occur. They know that the Israelis are going to face a dilemma, that when you put civilians amongst the highest value targets, then what are we going to do? Inevitably, we're going to have to attack. So you have one side of the conflict that's doing everything within its capability to create civilian casualties on both sides of the forward edge of the battle line, whether it's in Israel or in Gaza. You have another side of the conflict that's doing everything that's feasible to mitigate the risk to the civilian population. The warnings, the tactics, the weapon systems. I mean, if you just think about it objectively, which I know is very difficult in this environment, but if you just think about it objectively, if you compare the civilian, the collateral damage and incidental injury to civilians from the 2014 conflict to the 2021 conflict, it is a remarkable reduction on the part of the Israelis. In 2014, the IDF was caught by surprise with the tunnels. They weren't prepared to deal with them. They realized that the only way they could deal with them was the old-fashioned way, put their soldiers in the dirt of Gaza. And that required a combined arms ground maneuver operation in Gaza that was terribly destructive to the local infrastructure, that created immense risk for the Gazan civilian population and immense risk for the IDF soldiers as well. What happens between 2014 and 2021? The capabilities of the IDF are enhanced substantially to give their commanders options that avoid the need to engage in close combat with your enemy, the type of combat that your enemy is trying to bait you into, the ability to identify the location of the tunnel, the development of weapon systems that can destroy the tunnel from a standoff capability. Now, all of this is a manifestation of an institution that takes its obligation to come up with means meaning weapon systems and tactics that actually mitigate civilian risk, to comply with the international legal obligation to take constant care to mitigate the risk to the civilians in operations. This began in 2014. This is not just something that is manifested by issuing a warning before an attack or the knock on the roof. The training, the development, the intelligence, the weapon systems, all of that is designed to give Israeli commanders what they want, which is the ability to achieve their operational and tactical objectives in a way that they can say with good faith was done to mitigate the risk to the civilian population. And the fact that the Israelis didn't have to put ground forces into Gaza is a manifestation of that commitment. That will be completely overlooked in this report, in my opinion. There will be no credit given to the resources and time and effort devoted to that endeavor. The same goes to the point that Colonel Kemp made about target identification. Compliance with the law in the conduct of hostilities is not that complicated. Do everything you can to identify the true nature of the target. Ensure that you're only deliberately attacking enemy personnel and enemy objectives, which can include civilian facilities that have been transformed into military objectives. Use tactics and weapons that are designed to achieve your objective in a way that mitigate the risk to the civilian population, and refrain from conducting indiscriminate attacks. 4 key points. And the generals that reviewed the operations of the IDF, check, 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 check. As a matter of fact, as Colonel Kemp says, one of the concerns reflected in our report is not so much that the Israelis did more than they needed to, but the concern that there will be a misperception that what the Israelis were capable of doing in Gaza is a model for what you would have to do everywhere else. And those commanders recognized that the level of effort that the Israelis engaged in to mitigate civilian risk would be unrealistic in many other conflicts. Even if there was a conflict against Hezbollah on the northern front, you just wouldn't have the same capability, the same strategic space, the same opportunity. And so we have to be very careful. What the law requires is that commanders make good faith efforts to do what's feasible. But what's feasible changes from one operation to another, from one day to another. And the expectation that what you can do in Gaza is what you can do everywhere else is what concerned these commanders. Now think of the irony. You have the high-level commanders in Colonel Kemp's group. You have these experienced commanders in the Jinza group. They're all reaching the same conclusion. We're worried that the extensive efforts that the IDF made to mitigate civilian risk will be held up as a standard that can't be complied with in other operational situations. And then you have the rest of the world condemning Israel for not doing enough. There's an obvious disconnect. So the central theme of our report was, how do you deal with this kind of delta between actual legitimacy, and on that account, there was one party to the conflict that earned actual legitimacy, actual compliance with the law, that was the IDF, and there was another party to the conflict that had total disregard for the law, which was Hamas, and perceived legitimacy. Because legitimacy requires more than actual compliance. It requires the external community to recognize the commitment to the rule of law and the commitment to the obligations of international humanitarian law to do what's feasible to mitigate civilian risk. There's no easy answer to that. The efforts of UN Watch, the efforts of Colonel Kemp and his group, the efforts of Jinza, the efforts of any observer who kind of can separate all of the peripheral issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or debate and critique compliance with the laws of war in the conduct of hostilities as they are. In other words, separate all those other pieces, recognize that the law imposes an equality of application, right? You don't get a pass because you're the weaker enemy. That doesn't mean you're allowed to violate the law. And refrain from the most common corrupting influence in critiquing military operations, which is what I've called effects-based condemnation, where you just look at the effects of an attack and you draw an ipso facto conclusion that whoever caused that effect must have been acting illegally, when in fact it's much more complicated. And it is complicated. As a matter of fact, at dinner last night, I made the point that, look, I have no objection to critics looking at the effects of combat operations and saying those effects have some relevance in deciding whether one side or the other followed the law. It would be illogical to ignore the destruction of civilian property or the killing of civilians when you're just trying to figure out whether the law was complied with or not. But it's rarely dispositive. It's rarely conclusive. And the common instinct is to simply treat those visual effects as conclusive proof of illegality. And what that does is exactly what Colonel Kemp noted. It incentivizes the worst conduct of the worst enemies. Because what you then realize is if you can create a visual perception of destruction of civilian property and death to civilians, you're 99% where you need to be to paint the other side as illegitimate and illegal. And that has a corrupting effect. Because in fact, if we're going to critique compliance with international humanitarian law, what we have to do is approach it from an ex ante perspective, not a post hoc perspective. And that's the great iron here, isn't it? Colonel Kemp refers to Iron Dome. If we were to ask a different question, instead of asking how many civilians were killed and how many civilian buildings were destroyed, if we were to ask the question of attempted killing, how many civilians were attempted to be killed, how many civilian buildings were attempted to be destroyed, the ledger would be off the chart against Hamas. And yet, because the Israelis were effective at neutralizing those deliberate attacks against the civilian population and civilian property, because Hamas was inept in their efforts to achieve those objectives, somehow we think, well, obviously the Israelis must have been the evil actor here because look at the effects they had in Gaza. In fact, what we need to focus on is not the effect of an attack, but the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the attack judgment prima facie. That is what the law regulates. When Colonel Kemp was a commander, he could do everything right in terms of making a lawful judgment, and something could be wrong that he could not have known about. That doesn't mean he acted illegally. Or he could be fighting an enemy that's trying as best it can to kill civilians and is just inept in the effort and fails. That doesn't mean they're not the illegal actor. So ask this question. How many civilians did Hamas attempt to kill? How many civilian buildings did Hamas attempt to destroy? That's the ultimate question, because the attempt is the manifestation of the illicit judgment. So one of the things that I think is necessary in order to fight this legitimacy battle is to explain to international audiences what the law really demands of commanders. The law does not demand that you're right all the time. The law demands that you make reasonable judgments under the circumstances. And the best, I think, circumstantial evidence of whether you're dealing with commanders that take their obligation under the law seriously or not are all the efforts they make before the attack is launched to verify the true nature of the target, warn the civilian population, let the civilian population evacuate, et cetera, et cetera. What military lawyers put under this rubric of precautions in the attack to mitigate civilian risk. If we look at that as circumstantial evidence of good faith commitment to the law, again, the ledger favors the Israelis exponentially. So the fact that the Israelis were able to achieve their tactical and operational objectives in an 11-day campaign that did not involve the need for ground maneuver operations, that resulted in approximately 100 to 150 civilian casualties, is truly remarkable. That is a remarkable outcome when you're fighting an enemy, one, in the most densely populated urban area in the world, two, that has no respect for the law, three, that embeds its military objectives among the civilian population. So take two examples. Two operations that were got the most notoriety were, one, the attack on the tunnel system that resulted in the collapse of the civilian buildings, and the Al-Jabar Tower. Okay? What was remarkable from the perspective of our commanders and from my perspective was why wasn't anybody asking a prima facie question? Why were there tunnels under those civilian buildings? Why were they there? Nobody disputes that they were there. Nobody disputes that they were built by Hamas. Nobody disputes that they had military purpose. Why was Hamas using a building it knew was being used by international journalist organizations for a high-value electronic warfare effort to degrade Iron Dome? Now, when I was a military lawyer, if a commander had come to me, if Colonel Kemp had come to me and said, we've identified a facility in a building that's being used to develop an electronic warfare capability to jam Iron Dome, and he asked me how high value a target that would probably be higher than the enemy commander. That's the highest value target, because if you degrade Iron Dome, not only do you endanger the civilian population of Israel, you are going to compel a much more aggressive military action to neutralize the threat of those rockets and missiles. So, high value target. Then he says to me, I'm okay with letting the people that are in there evacuate. I'm okay with that. I can tolerate that. I can issue a pre-attack warning that makes sure everybody's out, including the enemy that's using it. I'll take that risk in order to protect the civilian population. And then he were to say to me, do you think that having identified the target, confirmed what it's being used for, and getting civilians the opportunity to evacuate, and using a precision-guided munition that will only destroy that building, do you think by doing that I'm complying with my obligations under the law? The answer would be, of course. But nobody asked the fundamental question, why did Hamas turn that building into a target? That was the illegality. That was the effort to use not only civilian property, but civilian property they knew was being used by news organizations to create a shielding effect. And yet, when the IDF destroyed that building, they didn't kill one civilian. Not one. Now, how that's a failure, how that manifests a failure to respect the rules of war is perplexing to me, perplexing to Colonel Kemp, perplexing to any commander who's had to make these difficult decisions of balancing the need to achieve your military objective against the risk to the civilian population. Part of this battle for legitimacy, is twofold. Number one, reject and fight back against effects-based condemnation. Right? It's too easy. And interestingly, we even see it happening now in the Ukraine-Russian conflict. Right? I think that there is evidence of pervasive Russian violation of the rules of war, but not every civilian building that's destroyed in Ukraine has been an illegal attack. There are some civilian buildings that are being used by Ukrainian forces. We have to be careful about jumping to conclusions that images prove illegality. And the more complex the operation, the less likely that is. And the more you're facing an enemy that's deliberately trying to embed its assets in the civilian population, the less likely that is. So that's one point we have to emphasize. The other is, I think we have to constantly remind the world that people who make these decisions are not robots, and they're not sociopaths. The commanders in the IDF at every level, from the senior level down to the lower level, they're human beings. And anybody who suggests that they are indifferent to causing civilian casualties, even when they were unavoidable operationally, it offends me. It offends me. I've known too many commanders in my career. I've worked for too many commanders. I never worked for a commander who I felt was a sociopath, who I felt enjoyed the idea of killing. It was bad enough to have to live with the consequence of killing your enemy. That's not an easy thing to live with. But when you have to make a decision that you know will result in the loss of civilian life, that's even harder to live with. Anybody who thinks that the commanders who made those decisions are cavalier or indifferent when their nation is providing power and water to the same civilian population is not credible. And we have to constantly remind people that these are good men and women who come up in a culture that values human life, that values morality. This is more than just law. This is more than just law. Commanders, good commanders, understand that their job in battle is to help their subordinates navigate the moral hazard of having to take life on command, but also come out of that miserable situation being able to live with the consequences of what they did. And guess what? It's the law that provides them the framework to help them do that. So I reject the idea that you can see widespread indifference to the obligations of the law in IDF operations. I think if you want an example of it, look at the enemy. The enemy doesn't care about the law because the enemy doesn't care about anything other than winning this information battle. So if we remind people of the fact that you have leaders who understand their moral obligation, and you have objective evidence over and over again that manifests commitment to the rule of law, then maybe in those margins of people who are still subject to being influenced, you start to explain to them why what they see doesn't always indicate the reality of what happened on the ground. And then we can start looking at the other evidence that proves you have manifestations of good faith at every level in the operation, and that's what deserves to be given credit, not condemnation.
Thank you very much, Professor Corn. We're going to be out of time very soon, but I'd like to offer each of the panelists 2 or 3 minutes if they would like to make any concluding remarks. Colonel Kemp.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I endorse fully, particularly the comments that Colonel Corn made about the concerns that high-level military commanders have about their own armed forces' abilities to achieve the same standards in protecting the lives of civilians while being effective against the enemy as the IDF achieved. The bar has been set to actually impossibly high standards for pretty much every other armed forces and every other conflict. So I think that was one of the major concerns of our commanders that conducted this investigation. And secondly, the point he made about human shields. I don't think of these as human shields. I think of them as human sacrifices, not necessarily willing sacrifices, but sacrifices nevertheless, because they're not there to shield a target. They're there to die when the target's hit. That is their purpose as designed by Hamas. And the final thing I just want to say is I find this almost a parallel universe that we're living in here today, where while the greatest war since 1945 is raging in Europe, the United Nations Human Rights Council is condemning the equivalent of the Ukrainian forces here and effectively supporting the equivalent of the Russian forces. They are actually acting in the same way as Putin's war is not only a kinetic war, it's also a propaganda war, very importantly. The United Nations Human Rights Council is acting as the propaganda arm of Hamas here. And they are effectively, while countries like Iran provide Russian weapons to Hamas, the UN Human Rights Council, this commission in particular, is providing the propaganda that backs that up, that gives Hamas strength, that encourages Hamas to carry on. And there are many parallels between the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza. It's obviously on a much smaller scale, far more limited on both sides. And there's a greater difference between the combat capabilities of the IDF and Hamas than there is between those of Russia and Ukraine. But nevertheless, there are many parallels, one of which is that the reason for invading, the reason for launching these offensive operations, illegal wars by Hamas and by Russia, is to annihilate what they consider, what they both consider, or each consider, to be an illegitimate entity. In the case of Russia, Ukraine, in the case of Hamas, Israel. And not only that, but they use the same excuses for it. Putin used the excuse for this war as being to protect the Russian-speaking population of eastern Ukraine in particular. Hamas used the excuse that they were protecting religious rights in Jerusalem. These are off the same playbook. They both like exploiting and bringing back the spectre of Nazism. Putin claims that, that he invaded partly in order to eliminate the Nazis in Ukraine. And Hamas, in their charter, describe Israel and Zionists as Nazis. These are common themes. And there are many, many more parallels that I could draw between these two conflicts. And I just find it absolutely remarkable that we have the United Nations Human Rights Council effectively supporting a mirror image of Putin's war as it's going on today.
I just quickly. So my comment goes directly to the reaction to the report and harkens back to my days as a criminal trial lawyer. As a trial lawyer, I knew that the value of an opinion, the probative value of an opinion, was only as good as the foundation upon which it rested, right? So my focus is conduct of hostilities. When you see a report that starts to criticize IDF conduct of hostilities, ask an important question. What is the foundation of expertise that those conclusions are built on? Because what you've just heard today is a group of very senior level military commanders. Now, by the way, to suggest that they're biased is really unfair. I know the commanders that were involved in the Ginza report. They had no connection to Israel. They had no connection to Ginza. Ginza just invites them to participate. So as soon as some people see the report, they see the title Jewish Institute, I'm going to dismiss it because obviously it's biased. That's unfortunate. They were agnostic when they went into the process. They're just trying to learn and bring their expertise. I'll give you one concrete example. The first preliminary report that came out, there was not much in there about the conduct of hostilities. But one line that jumped out to me was that the IDF did an insufficient job of verifying the true nature of the targets they attacked. If General Gibson had been able to come, retired three-star U.S. Army general, spend 30 years doing tactical and operational intelligence for the U.S. Army, spent hours with the IDF intelligence people looking at the processes of target identification and verification, she would tell you that that accusation is utterly absurd. She looked at what they did. She compared it to the best practices the U.S. uses. And so the question then becomes, for me, what is that opinion based on? Who is the expert in tactical and operational intelligence that you relied on, and what information did they rely on in order to reach that conclusion? It takes courage as an investigator to say candidly, you know what, I'm not sure. I'm suspicious, but I'm not sure. I don't have access to the information I need. I can't recreate the situation. And one thing that I've noticed in this reports is that type of analytical courage is always absent. There's never a report that says we're suspicious, this might have been illegal, but we cannot reach a credible conclusion. There always has to be a conclusion. And the reality is, as Colonel Kemp knows, and I know from doing investigations in the military, there are times when I would go to Colonel Kemp and I'd say, sir, I have to tell you, I think Captain Jones made a mistake, but I don't have enough evidence to be able to confirm it. And then the colonel would say, you've done your best to figure out what happened. I understand that. This is a problem. If everything requires a yes-no answer, you're going to get a yes-no answer. And then the question becomes, what is the foundation? So as we critique these reports, look beyond the conclusions and ask yourself, where did it come from? I would like to know, what military intelligence expert gave you the information you needed to make that accusation against the IDF? Maybe there's somebody there, I don't know. But unless that's transparent, unless you can look at the expertise of the people like in the high-level report or the Ginza report and critique whether or not they have an adequate foundation to draw these inferences and make these opinions, then the opinion isn't worth anything more than the paper it's written on. And if I were doing litigation, that's exactly what I would say to a jury. Sure, anybody can get up and say that's the cause of death, but this guy has no expertise in doing forensic analysis of a victim of a crime. So why pay attention to the opinion? So ask that question, particularly on conduct of hostilities. What is the foundation for the conclusions?
Thank you, Professor Corn. Thank you, Colonel Kemp. This concludes our first panel. We will take a coffee break for 15 minutes. We'll be back at 11:30 for our second panel, which will deal with the issues of alleged discrimination. Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second panel of our UN Watch side event, taking place in parallel with the 50th session of the Human Rights Council. Our first panel was on the issue of the laws of war regarding last year's Hamas-Israel conflict. Our second panel deals with allegations of systematic discrimination and the root causes of the conflict. I'll say just a word to introduce the subject. The Commission of Inquiry, as I mentioned previously, is distinct and unique in that all the previous commissions of inquiry concerning Israeli-Palestinian battles, there were about 9 of them, dealt with the particular conflict, whether it was the conflict in December 2008 and January 2009, whether it was the 2014 conflict or others. And this one is distinct in that it addresses the conflict of last year, issues arising before, after, but then it also talks about so-called root causes of the conflict, including systematic discrimination based on race, religion, etc. And it's quite clear what they had in mind is in the past year, we've had a spate of reports from several major NGOs accusing Israel of committing apartheid. And the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Palestine, a man named Michael Link, who for decades as a law professor in Canada was active in so-called Israel Apartheid Week, so that's something that he would say often, and that's why he was chosen for that job. And in his final report in March, he accused Israel of committing apartheid. So you had a series of NGO reports, the UN Special Rapporteur, whose mind was made up on this long time ago. And it seems quite clear that that is the direction that this commission will take. The initial report that came out last week is just a preliminary report. There's a hint to it in a footnote where they refer to the Convention on Apartheid. And I suspect that this finding by the commission will be made in either the fall or next spring here in Geneva. So in that regard, we've decided to address this issue, and we've invited a panel of distinguished experts who've come from near and far with a difficult journey. So appreciate their efforts to be here very much. And they will address different aspects of the issue. And our first speaker is my friend and colleague, Anne Herzberg. Anne is the legal advisor of NGO Monitor. She is a graduate of Oberlin College and Columbia University Law School. Prior to joining NGO Monitor, she worked as an attorney at a major law firm in New York. Her areas of research include business and human rights, international human rights law, the laws of armed conflict, universal jurisdiction, international fact-finding, NGOs, and the UN. Indeed, I would say Anne is one of the world experts on the commissions of inquiry such as the one that we're dealing with today. She's the author of the widely cited, quote, NGO Lawfare, Exploitation of Courts in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, co-author of Best Practices for Human Rights and Humanitarian NGO Fact-Finding, co-editor of the Goldstone Report Reconsidered, Critical Analysis, and Filling in the Blanks, Documenting Missing Dimensions in UN and NGO Investigations of the Gaza Conflict. Anne Herzberg's articles and op-eds have appeared in numerous publications, including the American Journal of International Law, Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, of which we have a representative here in the audience, Ynet News, and the Wall Street Journal. Anne is the co-author of a major study of the sudden spate of NGO reports that I referred to, which accuse Israel of the crime of apartheid, which she will present for us today. Anne, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Hillel, and thanks for having me here at this very important event today. And I just want to give an acknowledgement. My co-author, Joshua Kern, is in the back. And our reports are available on the NGO Monitor website, so I encourage everyone to take a look at them if you'd like more details for what I'm going to speak about today. I'm going to be talking about the COI and this charge of apartheid, and I'm going to use the Human Rights Watch report, which was released about a year ago, as the case study for that. But I just want to make two preliminary remarks that built upon what Colonel Kemp and Lieutenant Colonel Corn said at the last panel. And the first thing is that Lieutenant Colonel Corn spoke of a disconnect that is going on with this effects-based analysis versus what the laws of armed conflict require. And the reason we are seeing this disconnect in these COI reports, and this is not the first time this has happened, this is a pattern that's been going on since the Goldstone report in 2009, is precisely due to the lobbying of NGOs like Human Rights Watch. These are the organizations that are pushing this disconnect and trying to bifurcate the laws of armed conflict from international criminal law and from international human rights law. And in addition, they also spoke about looking at the foundation of conclusions that are in these reports. And this is also a critical point, that most of these commissions do not have the independent capability to conduct investigations, and therefore they rely almost entirely on reporting and claims from NGOs, and they do not verify those claims. They simply repeat them in their reports. It's simply a cut and paste job. And so again, that's what we're seeing here. And again, Human Rights Watch, as I'm going to get into, you can see their work all throughout this first report of Pillay's Commission of Inquiry. Now, the key purpose, or one of the key purposes of the Pillay Commission, is to set the stage to accuse Israel of apartheid. And again, as Hillel noted, the word does not appear in this report except for a brief reference to the convention. However, a lot of the language that's being used and the terminology is being drawn from these apartheid reports. And they're setting up the argument, they're echoing a lot of the arguments that are seen in these reports. And I'm going to get into a little bit of the background, which I think is very important, because I think that's going to clue us in as to when they are going to put these accusations clearly in their subsequent reports. And I also just want to highlight that on Thursday this week, the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People in New York is hosting a conference on apartheid with Agnes Kalmar, who is the executive director of Amnesty International, as well as Prince Zaid, who is the former High Commissioner for Human Rights. So lest anyone think, oh, apartheid was not in this report, that is not on the agenda anymore, it is clear that that is on the UN agenda. They're just building up their case for it. So it's very important to take note of all of these details that are happening on the sidelines. Now, the two background events have taken place, which is why Human Rights Watch issued its report when it did, and why Human Rights Watch's report was influential. Number one, in 2019, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court filed with the pretrial chamber of the ICC a request to confirm jurisdiction to open a full investigation in the situation of Palestine, even though Israel is not a member of the ICC. And in February 2021, the pretrial chamber agreed in a controversial 2-to-1 decision to confirm that jurisdiction. So the prosecutor in March opened a full investigation. And in the Rome Statute, which is the governing treaty of the ICC, there is a crime against humanity of apartheid. Secondly, in April 2021, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination decided that it had jurisdiction to hear a 2018 complaint filed by the Palestinians accusing Israel of discrimination and apartheid. This was the first time this procedure has ever been used, and the Office of Legal Affairs of the UN did not agree that the CERD had jurisdiction. Nevertheless, the CERD decided to go ahead, and they actually convened their first hearings a few weeks ago. So Human Rights Watch's report needs to be seen in this context. The report was issued in April 2021, and time to take advantage of these developments. And when you look at the recommendations of HRW's report, you will see how it ended up influencing what happened. So when the conflict broke out, not as the report says with the incidents in Sheikh Jarrah, what they conveniently leave out of the report is actually why did the conflict start? In April 2021, in the lead up to Ramadan, there was an increasing incitement campaign by the PA and by Hamas targeting Jews and revolving around the Temple Mount. And there were a series of attacks on visibly Orthodox Jews by Palestinians and these attacks were being filmed and posted on TikTok, which was leading to a spate of attacks. And then that led to a bunch of rioting on the Temple Mount. Then we had the Sheikh Jarrah protests, and then the rockets were fired on Jerusalem, the 6 rockets. And that is why the conflict then grew in intensity. But they used this conflict, the council used this conflict then as a perfect pretext, and then coupled with HRW's report to instead investigate what they call the root causes of the conflict, including systemic discrimination. Now I'm going to read to you 2 recommendations that were in HRW's report. First, quote, support the establishment of a commission of inquiry by the UN to investigate all forms of systemic discrimination or repression based on group identity in Israel or the OPT. That's one recommendation. Second one, quote, establish through the UN an international commission of inquiry to investigate systemic discrimination and repression based on group identity. The inquiry should be mandated to establish and analyze the facts and, where applicable, identify those responsible for serious crimes, including apartheid and persecution, with a view to ensure that the perpetrators of violations are held accountable, as well as collect and preserve evidence related to abuses for future use by credible judicial institutions. The inquiry's mandate should be sufficiently broad to cover the role of other actors, including companies and officials of other states. And lo and behold, this mirrors the mandate to a T of the COI. We have, by their own admission, if you look at their FAQs on the website, they admit it's the most unprecedented, broad-based inquiry that the Human Rights Council has ever had. And they've set up this inquiry to collect evidence that they hope to send to the ICC and that they hope will be preserved for use in domestic cases across the globe. So you can see how the recommendations in their report fit in perfectly to what the Human Rights Council was doing. Now, to turn to the report itself, and I have limited time, so I'm just going to highlight a few aspects of it. The release of the report was accompanied by a massive PR campaign promoting the narrative that previously the apartheid charge had only been confined to a few radical actors, but things had gotten so bad that a threshold had been crossed, and now mainstream groups like Human Rights Watch could no longer remain silent. But in fact, the charge has a very long history rooted in Arab and Soviet propaganda, and again, that's in our reports, and we're actually doing a lot more writing on this, and we're going to be publishing subsequent reports during the next year. Human Rights Watch report was actually basically a recycling of a report by Palestinian activists and UN rapporteur John Dugard in 2009. So they were basically recycling this 10-year-old report. And it's critical to note in the report, it is based on an invented law of apartheid that is aimed at decontextualizing apartheid from what occurred in South Africa from 1948 to 1994, give or take. And it's essentially what I call a Franken definition of apartheid. It mashes together the aspects of various legal instruments, notably the 1973 Apartheid Convention and the ICC Rome Statute. It fudges the concept of race to accuse Israel and Jews of racial discrimination. And also the concept of race is integral to the definition of apartheid. And it also equates the concept of domination, which is another core element of the crime, with simply that of control, rather than, again, stripping the notion of aggravated racial discrimination that is key to the crime of apartheid. Another pernicious aspect in the HRW report, and this is clearly echoed in Pillay's report, is that while it claims to only be accusing at this time, note at this time, of Israel practicing apartheid in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, a significant chunk of HRW's report focuses on supposed policies that are taking place in Israel. And again, we see this in Pillay's report. And there are many factual errors and distortions. And really to do a comprehensive debunking of these claims would require hundreds, if not thousands of pages. Again, you can go to our reports to see some of this debunking. But also, primarily, it's erasing the history of the conflict and taking out the security context. So it ignores that over time, the government has taken measures. It also ignores over time that the government has taken measures to ameliorate policies and practices that could be discriminatory and the types of policies that are present in every country of this world. There is no country in this world that does not have discriminatory practices and policies and can do better. But the core point of what HRW is doing is it's basing its legal claim of apartheid on the core foundational features of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, most prominently the law of return. So in other words, the entire report is aimed at attacking the legitimacy of the international legal foundations of the Jewish state. And you see this in its most extreme form in the Amnesty International report that came out in February and that was adopted by Michael Link in his March 2022 report to the Council. So HRW's recommendations in the report are clearly in line with this goal. So they call for extensive BDS measures by the entire international community, like apartheid South Africa. And what do we know about that campaign? That campaign was meant to eliminate the regime. And that's why they're adopting an apartheid South Africa campaign towards Israel, because that's the goal. They call on the PA to end security cooperation with Israel, and they also demand that Israel implement a so-called right of return, which again would eliminate Israel as a Jewish state. So the police, and I'll wrap up because I believe I'm out of time, but the Pillay Commission was clearly influenced by HRW, and I expect that as the commission continues its work, because as we know, it is a permanent commission, and we will be having 2 reports from this commission every year now, in perpetuity. We're going to be seeing more and more of the language of HRW's report. We're already seeing such things, such as the term fragmentation of the Palestinian people. We're seeing that in this report already. It's clear they're building up to it. And I think we'll be seeing, and I think what they're doing probably is waiting for the CERD committee to make some kind of recommendation so that they claim they have some basis for adding it to their reports. And I think we'll also start seeing more and more of HRW's recommendations, BDS, right of return, featured more and more prominently in the upcoming reports by Pillay. So I will end it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne, for setting the legal basis for our discussion. And now our next speaker can give us, I would say, a first-hand account, actually, from South Africa. I saw that Ken Roth, the head of Human Rights Watch, was recently interviewed on Dutch TV, and he began by saying, our report finds that Israel committed apartheid. Now, of course, we're not talking about South Africa. We're just talking about the legal definition. And I say apartheid to anyone in the world, and they think of South Africa, of course. And Human Rights Watch and all the other groups know that. So it's being, I would say, disingenuous to say we're accusing Israel of apartheid in a report that's 200 pages? Yeah. And it's our biggest campaign issue for the year. But of course, we don't mean South Africa when he says that and as a disclaimer. Of course, that's the whole point. So we have with us Olga Meshoe-Washington. She was born and raised in South Africa, where she worked as a lawyer, rising to become a partner at Weber Wenzel Attorneys, one of South Africa's preeminent law firms. Olga became a director and lead transformation consultant at Transcend Corporate Advisors, where she advised corporate entities and nonprofits on developing and implementing strategic socioeconomic development programs that were sustainable, had impact, and changed lives. Today, Olga serves as Chief Executive Officer of DEISI International, a nonprofit that is raising a movement for truth and justice regarding Israel. Olga is a regular on the speaker circuit in Africa and the United States for major organizations and has appeared on television numerous times. Parable magazine named Olga as one of South Africa's 2011 influential young Christian leaders, and in 2016 she received the Jerusalem Award from the World Zionist Organization. Olga currently serves as the regional director and educator for Club Z. She has described herself as adventurous, energetic, and possibly a bit of a workaholic. Olga enjoys the arts, reading, and politics, and is passionate about the development and uplifting of young people and underserved communities. Olga, thank you so much for coming from far across the world to be with us today.
Well, thank you, Hillel, for having me here today, and thank you to UN Watch for all that you do. I was born in Pretoria, which is the capital city of South Africa, so I've never doubted that I was a South African. However, a few years ago, that certainty wavered. I was looking at a copy of my birth certificate when I noticed that the citizenship designated to me was not South African. I remember calling my dad and exclaiming, Dad, I'm not South African. And he responded, what are you talking about? Of course you are. I proceeded to explain to him that my birth certificate listed the city of my birth as Pretoria, but it gave me citizenship of Bophuthatswana. Wow, he replied. He and my mom had never picked that up. After a few inquiries to the Department of Home Affairs, I was issued with another certificate that stated my citizenship as South African. Bophuthatswana was one of the several homelands created within South Africa by the apartheid government as a place that black people were to live in according to their tribes. It was one of the products of the over 150 codified laws that were intricately and interwoven for the sole purpose to separate non-white South Africans from black South Africans, or rather from white South Africans, in all areas of life. Black South Africans were dispossessed of their land, homes, and livelihoods, and forcibly relocated to designated underdeveloped areas. Many were stripped of their South African citizenship. There was a season in my dad's life when his passport described him as stateless. Our only crime being black. By laws, black South Africans were prohibited from using the same transportation and health systems and from enjoying the same public amenities as white South Africans. We were denied the right to vote. We were forbidden from marrying someone of a different race. Not only could we not attend the same schools as white South Africans, the education system afforded to us was deliberately of a lower standard, underscoring the belief on which apartheid was premised. Black people were morally and racially inferior to white people, and so had to be separated from them on all levels of society and treated as second-class citizens. That was apartheid. That is not what Israel is. I often find myself in a comical state of disbelief and awe that Israel continues to be labeled as an apartheid state. I'm going to leave it in the interest of time to Yoseph to describe Israeli life, but I will say this. The diversity of Israeli politics, policies, culture, and overall Israeli life is incomparable to apartheid South Africa. Because Israel haters are determined that Israel be accused of being an apartheid state and so be guilty of committing a crime against humanity, a new definition of apartheid is now being advanced by non-governmental organizations and authors to perpetuate this decades-old lie conceived by Soviet and Arab propaganda machinery. The disassociation of apartheid from the South African experience, which frankly is the genesis of apartheid, and imposition on Israel of the intent to commit apartheid, is troubling for many reasons. It trivializes the humiliation and injustices endured by black South Africans who lived through apartheid and who still, together with their descendants, bear their scars of its legacy. I'm of the opinion that it goes further. I believe it erases the very real, very lived experiences of the brutality of apartheid, a reality that includes mothers who to this day do not know what happened to their children, and millions of black South Africans who had to flee their country and live in exile under fear of persecution purely because of the color of their skin. My people's history and our experience is being used as an anti-Semitic tool to politically, morally, and with the most incredible pretzel-like twisting and legal gymnastics that I have seen, legally delegitimize Israel with a hope to criminalize her. Israel critics who use the false apartheid claim often cite black Africans who hold or held similar views. They say things like, well, Bishop Desmond Tutu said that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is apartheid. It is true that the late Bishop Tutu said these things. It is also true that South Africa's ruling party, the African National Congress, has in recent years adopted an increasingly antagonistic stance towards the Jewish state. But South Africans are not a monolith. From faith leaders to politicians, business personnel to community leaders, many have called out and do call out this lie. In his address at the 37th Congress of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, Nelson Mandela said, "We," referencing the African National Congress, "recognize the legitimacy of Palestinian nationalism just as we recognize the legitimacy of Zionism as Jewish nationalism. We insist on the right of the State of Israel to exist within secure borders, but with equal vigor support the Palestinian right to self-determination." King Goodwill Zwelithini, the late king of South Africa's largest tribe and ethnic group, the Zulus, retired Chief Justice of South Africa's Constitutional Court, Chief Justice Mogoeng, South African parliamentary member and leader of one of the opposition parties in South Africa's government, Reverend Dr. Kenneth Mishwe, Bishop Dr. Barnabas Lechanyana, leader of the Zionist Christian Church, the largest African-initiated church in Southern Africa, are names that you may not have heard before. But these are names of South African leaders who do not equate support for the Palestinian people as having to be anti-Israel. They are leaders who publicly debunk the labeling of apartheid against Israel, who see the importance of a strong South African relationship for the benefit of all South Africans and all Africans. On 21 June 2004, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan noted that the United Nations emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust, and that a human rights agenda that fails to address anti-Semitism denies its own history. He also said that the fight against anti-Semitism must be the United Nations fight, and that the Jews everywhere should feel that the United Nations is their home too. It thus boggles the mind why the United Nations Human Rights Council would establish a commission inquiry that is anti-Semitic, that stretches indefinitely into the future and into the past, that is one-sided, and is chaired by someone who has made no secret her anti-Israel bias. The weaponization of apartheid by the United Nations and now the Commission of Inquiry makes a mockery of what the United Nations was mandated and is mandated to do, and that is enhance international cooperation for the promotion and protection of all human rights. The continued misuse of apartheid makes peace for Israelis and Palestinians unattainable because it creates a barrier from holding Hamas and the Palestinian Authority accountable for their mistreatment of the Palestinian people. It attacks, as well as attacks against Israelis, be they Jewish, Arab, Druze, and Christian, and because it prevents the truth. There can be no justice without truth. The apartheid narrative also has implications for a region whose significance in this conversation cannot be ignored, and that is Africa. In 2021, Israel was rightfully awarded observer status at the African Union. Arab leaders have led the protest in denouncing this move. Surprise, surprise. Oh, the hypocrisy that the Palestinian Authority should enjoy observer status, but a country that has done much good for African nations and the African people should be denied this same privilege. When members of the African Union gathered earlier this year to vote whether to retain or remove Israel's observer status, Moussa Faki Mahamat, chairperson of the African Union Commission, noted that 44 of the 55 countries that comprise Africa recognize Israel and have established diplomatic relations with the state. Many African states have opened their markets and economic space to Israeli enterprises and have signed cooperation agreements in fields including, but not limited to, education, defense, security, intelligence, nuclear cooperation, agriculture, technological innovations, health, economy, and finance. It is thus a mystifying situation that this reality is not reflected by African nations at the United Nations. The apartheid lie is instead brandished against the strengthening of ties by African nations with Israel. African nations are expected to, and have indeed made peace and forged close ties with nations that colonized us, that enslaved our people, and that slaughtered us like animals. Israel, who we are told to shun, has committed no such atrocities. As a proud daughter of the African continent, I respectfully ask African leaders, how has lending support for hatred against the Jewish people progressed the needs of the continent? We have propped up the morally and legally corrupt notions that Israel is guilty of apartheid, colonization, and genocide. To what benefit? Africa is now the global eye of terrorism, and slavery is rampant in no less than 5 African countries, some of which have already had a seat and do have a seat on the Human Rights Council. Our support for the Palestinian people should be lent where it will change the status quo, demanding their liberation from Hamas and Palestinian leadership that denies them basic and fundamental human rights. We have for far too long lent our name, lent our history, lent our votes to the centrality of a program that seeks to demonize and isolate the Jewish state, more so than it seeks to improve the lives of the Palestinian people. It is time for Africa to reassume her rightful place as a leader in relations with Israel, just as she did 3,000 years ago by way of Queen Sheba, who visited King Solomon in Jerusalem. As was evidenced at the dawn of many African democracies in the 1950s and 1960s, close relations with Israel has real and meaningful economic, health, food security, counterterrorism, and many other benefits for the African people. I would have never thought that I would ever quote Elvis Presley, but allow me to do so as I close. There's a first time for everything. Elvis said, "Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it ain't going away." Here is to continuing to work towards the day when the light of truth will shine through the corridors of the United Nations and illuminate all its chambers. The truth that, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Israel is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world and a marvelous example of what can be done, how desert land can be transformed into an oasis of brotherhood and democracy.
Thank you, Olga, for your very powerful and inspiring words. You quoted Martin Luther King, someone with whom our founder worked closely, Morris Abram, who drafted the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And you also quoted my father's hero, Elvis Presley. So that's a great combo. Our next speaker is Yoseph Haddad, my friend. He's the CEO of Together Vouch for Each Other, an organization bridging the gap between the Arab sector of Israeli society with Israeli society as a whole. Born in Haifa, Haddad is an Israeli Arab who moved with his family to Nazareth at the age of 3. At 18, he decided to volunteer in the Israel Defense Forces and served in the Golani Brigade. In 2006, the Second Lebanon War broke out. At a battle in Bint Jabil, a Cornet missile shot by Hezbollah severely injured Yosef, severing his leg and wounding him in multiple places on his body and face. After a long rehabilitation process, his leg was reattached, and today he can even play soccer again. On account of this fateful experience, Yosef decided to dedicate his life to showcasing the truth about the state of Israel abroad, fighting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, known as BDS, and working to improve relations between Arabs and Jews by bridging social gaps in Israel. He is now a renowned lecturer around the world to diverse communities, groups, and students. If you follow him on social media, he has a huge following, over 150,000 followers on Facebook and many more on other channels. He spoke at powerful events in Ireland and Chile and other very welcoming places for the message that he has, I'm sure. In 2018, to help bridge the gaps between Arabs and Jews in Israel, Yosef founded the organization Together Vouch for Each Other. Since its inception, the organization has grown to hundreds of volunteers with thousands of supporters on social media. Yosef has been named as one of the top 40 digital influencers for Israel by JNS. He is also a TEDx speaker, a contributor at I-24 News, and a regular commentator on Israeli TV networks in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. I like to appear on video, but if I really want to know how to do it right, I try to watch Yosef and his fiancée, Emily. Last year, on behalf of UN Watch, he testified before the United Nations by remote video, and today we are delighted to host him here in person. Yoseph Haddad.
Well, thank you very much for this warm introduction, and again, thanks for having me here. It is an absolute pleasure and important as well. Just before I start my speech, I do want to address a few things of what Olga mentioned, because it is important. I visited South Africa myself, and during apartheid week in Johannesburg, and one of the fascinating things that I found when I spoke to students in Johannesburg is, after I told them the story about the Arabs in Israel, also as well in the West Bank and in Gaza, I then said the sentence, making the, referring to the real apartheid that happened in South Africa and compare it to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it is actually doing injustice to the South African who suffered from a real apartheid regime. And this is something that I found also fascinating, to see the comments and the responses from South African while I was speaking there, nodding their head with acceptance after they heard the reality of the Arabs, whether it's in Israel or in the West Bank or in Gaza. So I had to say something about that. As an Israeli, I am not surprised to be discussing in another UN report which obsessively bashes my country here at the UN in Geneva. In fact, it's more of the same old, same old. But you know what? As an Arab, I'm absolutely fed up. I'm fed up because this obsession against Israel actually prevents resources and attention from being put up in the right places, both inside Israel as we work to bridge gaps between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, and internationally. As an Arab Israelis, we have many problems to resolve within our society. For example, Arab Israelis are vastly underrepresented in government employee positions. What should be closer to 20% of employees is more like 1.5%. Our schools are not up to the standards they should be. And we have a massive problem with illegal weapons. But instead of finding productive solution to meet these challenges, bodies like the UN have no idea what's actually going on in Israel, are lecturing us, Arab Israelis, about how our life is as minorities in our own country. Even worse, they presented it as if we Arab Israelis are not in fact Israelis with equal rights under the law, the same as any Jewish Israeli. For example, they cited the nation-state bill in the report, a bill I actually oppose because it doesn't go far enough to emphasize Israel's democracy nature. But they misrepresented the very essence of the bill, claiming it impacts the civil status access to social and economic benefit or the right to land and property for Arab Israelis. This is a flat-out lie. Let me clarify for the Commission of Inquiry that I am an Arab Israeli with equal rights under the law in the State of Israel. We do not need the UN or the EU or any other body to come to tell us how to run our country, and such reports only inflame tensions in the region and embolden extremists who damage the unity between Arabs and Jews in Israel. This report, at its core, fundamentally misunderstood the conflict and misattributed every social ill, and I mean every social ill that impacts Palestinians, to Israel. The Commission of Inquiry, like others before, it was intended to address alleged crime wars in the last Gaza operation in May 2021. But reading out through these 18 pages of drivel, it isn't thorough investigation, but the facts on both sides, but rather a poorly researched report filled with sloppy, false information, almost none of which even addresses the Gaza operation. The UN Human Rights Council extended their mandate to address all underlying root causes the recurrent tensions. All. Nowhere in this report did they address the underlying root causes of Palestinians refusing to recognize my country's right to exist, or the fact that Palestinians have rejected multiple offers for peace, or the issues of incitement within Palestinian culture, or the Palestinian leadership's corruption. No, they just blamed Israel. I guess we can't really be surprised when the head of the commission, Navi Pillay, is a known anti-Israeli activist who smeared my country as apartheid and supported boycotting it. Does that sound like an impartial investigator? Yes, this is it. This is what the UN Human Rights Council is spending their resources on. While China puts Muslims in concentration camps, Afghanistan is run by the Taliban, which is a cracking down on women's rights. Iran is the largest sponsor of global terrorism, and Russian troops commit war crimes and sexual assault, including against children. The UN Human Rights Council is paying for this Commission of Inquiry to spread lies about Israel and minimize responsibility on the Palestinian side. Now, let's review a few of those lies in this report. First, they simply don't know the facts. They claim that Israel occupies Gaza as a result of the blockade, including land crossings and borders, as well as civilian infrastructure, including water and electricity. This is a lie. The blockade is an Egyptian-Israeli blockade, and even this report contradicts itself by stating in another section that they appealed to Egypt for permission to enter Gaza via the Rafah crossing and received no response. They also falsely claimed that Israel's blockade hindered water and sanitation in Gaza, damaging the health system. As per Oslo, the Palestinian Authority assumed full responsibility for their own health care. They also claimed that the entire territory discussed in the Oslo Accord, Area A, B, C, as well as Gaza, was to be handed over the Palestinian. This is blatantly false. The territory was to be decided only in the final status negotiations. And then you wonder, has even the UN read the Oslo Accords? Here's something the UN should learn. Water and electricity is paid for and provided by the Palestinian Authority, not Israel. It is a bitter internal political fight between Fatah and Hamas that prevents adequate resources from being invested in building better water sanitation, generators, and water aquifers, not Israel. But that didn't stop this report from blaming Israel for destroying Palestinian water infrastructure and then lying about the cause of the problem. Experts in Israeli civil administration confirm that Palestinians constantly avoid meetings with their Israeli counterparts to address the problems of water shortages in the Palestinian territories. After all, and listen to this, the UN is literally providing incentives for Palestinian leaders to behave this way. It gets them more aid money when their people suffers. We know for certain that the water pipelines aren't separated between Jews and Arabs. They are shared. Shortages in the water are widespread because Palestinian police do not prevent the illegal siphoning off of water to Palestinians who dig into the pipelines. Nobody talks about that, by the way. Many of which span the entire West Bank, such as the pipeline which runs through Hebron. In another lie, the report claims Israel allows the establishment of Jewish settlements outposts. In fact, Israel destroys illegal construction regardless of who builds it. And recent years have shown that more illegal Jewish constructions were removed than Palestinians. They criticized Israel for correctly labeling 6 NGOs as terror fronts for the PFLP, claiming it is a threat to civil society. Really? Because there are 45,000 NGOs in Israel, and none of them seems to have this problem, including NGOs like B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence, which work against the state. Additionally, there are hundreds of anti-Israeli international and Palestinian NGOs operating in West Bank and Gaza. But you mean to tell me that Israel labeled only 6 of them just for fun? It is not even logical. The report falsely claimed that the purpose of Sheikh Jarrah house evictions were for the benefit of settlers. Again, misrepresenting the reality of a complex lawsuit which had been going on for decades, in which the tenant refused to pay rent to the legal owners of the property. It also claimed that the May violence broke out partially as a result of the use of force by Israel against Palestinians during Ramadan, which is an outright lie. Every year, Israel grants thousands of additional permits for Muslims to worship freely at Al-Aqsa during Ramadan, unlike Jews, by the way. The riots in May 2021 occurred due to Palestinian instigating violence, not Israel. The report stated that Israel has a 3-tiered system of laws for Jews, Palestinian citizens of Israel, apparently it's up to them to identify my identity, and Palestinians in East Jerusalem. This also claimed that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are eligible for Israeli citizenship. Another lie. They're all eligible to apply for Israeli citizenship, and many of them actually have. Aside from the outright lies, this report places sole responsibility of Israel, but gives Hamas and Palestinian leadership a free pass. For example, they mentioned Israel 157 times. But the terrorist organization, Hamas, only 3 times. They claim that there is an issue of accountability with Israel, and such as Israel is responsible for the failure of Palestinians to stop domestic violence. Yes, seriously, that's what it says. They stated that the occupations is the core of cause of unemployment in Gaza, with no mention of the rampant corruption, of misuse of fundings, and terrorism by Hamas. They even complained that the Palestinians haven't held election in over a decade and blamed Israel for it. Yeah, we are the one to blame for not having elections. They intentionally misrepresented the facts by condemning Israel for targeting residential buildings in Gaza while ignoring IDF efforts to evacuate the buildings ahead of time and the role of Hamas in using residential buildings for terrorist activities. It's not even me saying that. Even Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar said it himself in an interview. They slam Israel for what they call discrimination in granting building permits and its impact on the Israeli Bedouin communities. But no mention of the multiple times Hamas has confiscated lands from Palestinians in Gaza and even used live fire against Palestinian protesters. And by the way, this literally happened this week. The report rests on false premise that until occupation ends, this issue will not be resolved for Palestinians. It reminds me of a famous statement by former US Secretary of State, John Kerry, in which he insisted that there will be no peace in the region until the Palestinians have peace with Israel. Well, guess what? As we saw with the Abraham Accords, this is the furthest from the reality and the truth. But supporting or opposing occupation isn't even the question here. The question is, will ending occupation, as the UN claims, really end the conflict and the problems for Palestinians? As an Arab, I am here to tell you unequivocally, no. Ending the occupation will not end the conflict, nor will it resolve the social problems within Palestinian society. Where the UN should be stressing pressure on the Palestinian Authority and the terrorist organization Hamas to stop violence, they are blaming Israel for defending itself. Where the UN should be holding NGOs which fund terrorism accountable, they are condemning Israel for exposing the truth about them. Where the UN should be demanding the Palestinians recognize the right of Israel to exist, the problem which led to present-day situation in the West Bank after the Six-Day War, the UN instead panders to corrupt Palestinian leaders who have led and are leading their own people towards violence and destruction. My message to the UN itself in this is if you want to see a genuine peace with Israelis and Palestinians, stop fueling lies and incitement with reports like this that enable the fundings and those exploitation of the Palestinian people by their own leaders. Your interference is hurting far more than helping. You are part of the problem. This peace will be made by Arabs and Jews on the ground, not by your report produced to justify your outrageous, inflated budgets and lack of result to show for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yosef, for your very powerful testimony. This will be submitted in its entirety to the Commission of Inquiry. If, as they did in this latest report, they disregard these submissions, we will hold them to account. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Our next and final speaker, who can give us perhaps the larger picture of what is going on with these accusations and why is all this happening. We've brought an intellectual, Dr. Einat Wilf, who is the co-author of The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. She is a leading thinker on matters of foreign policy, economics, education, Israel, and Zionism. Einat was a member of the Israeli parliament from 2010 to 2013, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Born and raised in Israel, Dr. Wilf served as a foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres and a strategic consultant with McKinsey & Company. Dr. Wilf has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. She recently served as the Goldman visiting professor at Georgetown University. Dr. Wilf is the author of 6 books that explore key issues in Israeli society. We are honored and delighted that Einat recently joined the board of UN Watch and that she took the time and made the effort to be with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the honor of being with UN Watch, and especially in this panel to be with such impressive and courageous warriors, so thank you. The root cause of the conflict. The root cause of the conflict has only ever been one, and that is the complete denial and rejection of the universal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. There has never been any other cause for the conflict. And because this has been the cause of the conflict, it has determined everything at every point. It meant that there was Arab opposition to Jewish immigration to the embryonic state of Israel, closing the gates to the Jewish people at their most desperate hour. That is before there is any occupation or settlements. It means that the war that was waged in 1948 was a total war against the establishment of a sovereign state for the Jewish people in any borders whatsoever. It means that no peace was made with that state once it was established in the war. It means that total war continued later. It means that in 1967, when the total war continued, even then there was refusal to make peace with the Jewish state. Therefore, anyone who claims that Israel's military control of the West Bank and Gaza is the cause of the conflict either doesn't know history, doesn't know how to count. Israel's military control of the West Bank is an outcome, is a symptom. An outcome cannot be the cause. And the fact that despite multiple efforts, Israel could not end its military control, because at every juncture, when the Palestinians faced a choice, they could have a state for themselves, a fully sovereign Arab Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with no settlements, ending the occupation, capital in East Jerusalem, whenever they faced a choice that they could have that state. But the price of that state was that the Jewish people will have that state on the other part of the land, at least to date. They have decided that this is too high a price to pay. This is why Israel's military control of the West Bank remains, because whenever Israel seeks to end it in an agreement or otherwise, another clock is brought to bear, the Palestinian Arab clock that says Israel is a temporary foreign presence in this land, and we only have to be patient, and they will ultimately disappear. Now, this complete rejection was backed for many decades by the Soviet Union, by the Islamic world, and through that was brought into the United Nations, beginning especially in the 1970s. A lot of the traditional Soviet and European animosity was actually outsourced to the Islamic and Arab world for the purpose of ensuring that the Jewish state will not enjoy a single day of peace and a single day of legitimacy. But the Soviet Union is gone. The Arab world is beginning to change its attitude. There is no single better word than Abraham to flip the traditional attitude of the Arab and Islamic world towards the Jewish state. If the traditional view has been that Israel is a foreign implant in the region, and in order to convey that it was foreign, you say that it is a settler, white, colonialist entity, this is how you say it's foreign. And if it's foreign, it means it's temporary, because if anything is foreign, it has to be pushed out, and ultimately will not last. This is the traditional view in the Arab and Islamic world, and this is the reason that no compromise is made with Israel. But then under the Abraham Accords, this is flipped. The word Abraham. There's no better way to flip the narrative than to say, you are not foreign, white, settler, colonial implant in the region. You're Abraham. You're kin. You belong here, and we recognize you as a people with a history and a culture in this region, and we embrace you by virtue of belonging in. So, the Soviet Union is gone. Some in the Arab world are no longer interested in committing their resources to fighting the Jewish state. So, as someone half-jokingly commented, when Europe realized that it could no longer outsource its anti-Semitism to the Arab and Islamic world, it's now bringing production back home. And this is what we're saying right now. We see this linguistic change where it was once recognized that the conflict is the Arab-Israeli conflict. There is the numerical dominance of the Arab and Islamic world against the Jewish state, and it's a total war against the Jewish state. And then it became the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, inverting the conflict, making Israel the Goliath and the Palestinians the David. But it was still a conflict, somehow saying that both sides have legitimate grievances. And then the Israeli-Palestinian conflict only became about the occupation, turning the Palestinians into victims, into passive elements in this element who have basically no agenda. But the problem with occupation is that it's still legal. An occupation is a legal way of governing a territory acquired in war until the status of that territory is resolved in peace. So now we move from occupation to apartheid, which brings us full circle to the beginning, because apartheid means that a Jewish state in any borders whatsoever is illegitimate. And that was the beginning of the conflict to begin with, that a Jewish state in any borders is illegitimate, and therefore total and complete war against it is the proper way to act. Now, why apartheid all of a sudden now? We look at this transition, we look at the West bringing production back home, creating the idea that a Jewish state is illegitimate. Has anything changed on the ground? Absolutely nothing. If anything, things have changed for the better. But all of a sudden, you have several organizations all saying the same things. If you try to ask yourselves, oh, what is the objective reason? You will not find an objective reason. The only way to understand it is to understand that the human rights regime, as much as it has noble ideals, it has also established itself as a modern secular church with some of the beautiful ideals, but also with the same sinister notion that the Jews are always to blame. And the human rights is now the secular church of many, and they are telling them, as the secular church, those are the people that are always at sin. They have a perpetual sin. This is why the current commission of inquiry is perpetual, because the Jewish state is always a sin. It does not matter what it did yesterday or today or tomorrow. This is a sin, and it, through that, the human rights worlds elevate itself once more to having the mantle of the secular church. It is by now a theological obsession with the Jews and the Jewish state, which is why we are participating in the equivalent of the medieval debates, when the Jews had to debate against Christianity, and when they won the debate, they were massacred, and when they lost the debate, they were massacred. And this is but a modern reiteration of these medieval debates, with the happy change that we can now protect ourselves. But to end on an optimistic note, because so much of this is perennial, about a few years ago, there was an interview in a documentary with someone who was still alive of the perpetrators of the Munich massacre, the Palestinian kidnapping, torture, and attack of Israeli athletes in the 1972 Munich Olympics, a high point in the moment of putting the Palestinian so-called cause on the international stage. And the perpetrator was very much proud of it. He said, "This has been our greatest achievement. Beginning at that moment, we have placed the Palestinian cause on the international stage." And I thought to myself, very well, a great achievement in your world. And what sense? What have you achieved since? And I think this goes to the core issue. As long as the Palestinian cause remains as a top priority, the non-existence of the Jewish state, it will continue to fail, because this is a destructive cause, and this is a cause that brings nothing good to the world. The day that the Palestinians will finally adopt a constructive cause, a cause that is to build a Palestinian state next to Israel rather than instead of Israel, that is the day that they will both have their state and that we will all have peace. But to get to that point, they have to extract themselves from being the servants of the ancient hatred of so much in Europe against the idea of the Jews being sovereign, equal, and masters of their fate. Thank you.
Thank you, Einat, for your important words and helping us understand what's going on here at the United Nations and really in the human rights world, and I would say here in Europe. This concludes our side event on the Commission of Inquiry into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the report which will be debated in a few hours here at the United Nations. The statements that were made here will all be uploaded on our website, unwatch.org, in video, and can be shared through social media this afternoon. So please visit unwatch.org to share what you've heard. And once again, we'll be submitting all of the testimonies here to the Commission of Inquiry, and in the hope that they will listen. And I said, if they won't, we will hold them to account. Thank you very much.
Thank you.